One of the things that I think is really helpful for a PM is to realize that, the way that they can help a designer is actually to think about the constraints that are producing a particular design. Because sometimes like a design might not make sense, but it might be because the designer is operating under the wrong constraints. Maybe they have to stick to this design system, or they're limited what they're able to explore because they've been told that they have to kind of like just stick to these box, or there's some feasibility thing. So that's one thing I think a lot about and encourage PMs to think about, which is like, hey, like you can actually be a partner, even as you're critiquing a design by kind of critiquing the constraints rather than design itself. So that's kind of one thing I think about. And then, the other thing is like really speaking in the language of users, right? Like when I think about, some PM designer interactions, maybe PMs are very oriented around goals and KPIs. But when I think about designer, they're so human centered. And so how do you actually, shift to the language more towards what a user is feeling, or, what goal they're trying to achieve, or a particular user journey?
My guest today is Yuhki Yamashita, Chief Product Officer at Figma. Yuhki and I talked about how Figma created a culture where employees love their craft, how they build AI products to solve real user problems, and how they plan to make design accessible to everyone. Yuhki is a fantastic storyteller and shares an inside look at how Figma's amazing product culture works. If you enjoy our conversation, please like and subscribe to support the podcast. All right, well, welcome, Yuhki. Really glad to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Peter.
Yeah, since you work at Figma, let's start this question. You probably have managed both PMs and designers. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on, how PMs can be great partners for designers and vice versa.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on this. I mean, I think for a PM, one of the things that I think about is, when I've written a lot about this, but basically, it's very easy to kind of critique designs and make it feel really personal or really get detailed. But one of the things that I think is really helpful for a PM is to realize that, the way that they can help a designer is actually to, think about the constraints that are producing a particular design. Because sometimes like a design might not make sense, but it might be because the designer is operating under the wrong constraints. Maybe they have to stick to this design system, or they're limited in what they're able to explore because they've been told that they have to kind of like just, stick to this box, or there's some feasibility thing. So that's one thing I think a lot about and encourage PMs to think about, which is like, hey, like you can actually be a partner, even as you're critiquing a design by kind of critiquing the constraints rather than design itself. So that's kind of one thing I think about. And then, the other thing is like really speaking in the language of users, right? Like when I think about, some PM designer interactions, maybe PMs are very oriented around goals and KPIs. But when I think about designer, they're so human centered. And so how do you actually, shift to the language more towards what a user is feeling, or, what goal they're trying to achieve, or a particular user journey? So those are some things that I think a PM can do to be a better partner to a designer.
Got it.
And then in terms of a designer, I think that, recognizing that, PMs are often thinking about like goals, they're thinking about trade-offs, right? And, surfacing, also borrowing from some of that language. And, Julie Joel has a lot of great tips that she's written about that I really love, about how, designers can contemplate the way PMs think. And like, I think, I really highly encourage people to read that as well.
I think the traditional PM role has been all about, moving the numbers and right, that kind of stuff. But I think one of Figma's values is love your craft. So how do you kind of screen PMs for this value, like during the hiring process?
Yeah. I mean, it's really interesting. Like sometimes it's very self-evident, right? Like in some cases, we've had PMs share some of their work, or, do a short assignment, and, kind of the attention to detail they might have, or even the attention to like these small little things that, a user might care about. Like the passion for that, when that shines through, it's really obvious that like, they really care about those kinds of details, and they don't need a metric to tell them to care. So there are some subtle cues like that. And then, I think the other thing is just whether or not you really get excited about building great user experiences, right? And I think like some people are just really really just are thrilled to like create amazing experiences, and others are doing it in service of a goal. And, I think some people, when I find people who just inherently want to make the experience better for the user, who are very natural at thinking about kind of like through the user's eyes, like those are people who tend to also quote, love your craft. But yeah, those are some things I look for.
Got it. And, with your PM org, like how do you balance this craft value with moving the numbers, with maybe like internal optics, like having a great product review with data or something? Like how do you evaluate your PMs with all this stuff?
Yeah. I mean, hopefully it's not about the product review per se, right? But I mean, I think that everyone has goals, right? And it's just that sometimes those goals are much more measurable, and sometimes those goals are a little bit less measurable and high level. And so for me, it's really about, are you setting good goals? And, are you demonstrating your ability to hit them, even if it's not always like completely perfect how you measure it, right? So that's kind of the thing. And so even when we do things like, building great user experiences, it comes from a place of, I want to solve this particular problem, or I want to address this sentiment from the community. And so there are ways in which we want to have confidence that after having launched it, you actually met those goals. So those definitely are ways in which like I evaluate PMs, right? Because what we're trying to do is solve problems, and, teach you to solve the problems. And it's just the case that unfortunately, not every problem is as measurable as others, but that's okay. And that shouldn't prohibit you from being a good PM.
So like, are there some cases where like you don't run A/B tests for everything? You just get qualitative feedback, or like measure how you solve the problem some other way?
Definitely. I mean, like there are many cases where, there might be actual physical constraints of why you can't run that experiment. And so, maybe we don't want to create an experiment that randomly creates new types of primitives that we'll have to support forever if we choose to deprecate it, right? So that might be an example of, wanting to put people in a beta environment first and just test it there before kind of making a call. Or, there may be things that we have just absolute conviction of because we've been spending so much time with users, in which case we're more comfortable doing kind of like a pre-post analysis or something like that. So there's definitely a wide array of things that we do that aren't experiments, but, for nowadays, it's easy to just roll stuff out too. So like, it's not like we, carelessly launch stuff and just hope for the best. I think there's responsible ways to do it too.
Got it. So you also mentioned about, how PM should be responsible for the why, right? Like why is this problem more important than other problems to solve? And I was wondering if you have any tips for folks on how to become better at like storytelling and explaining the why to people.
I mean, I think that I kind of look for this in an interview too, which is like, can I explain the why of something to someone who's not even in the company, who's unfamiliar with this problem at hand? Because that person will have have a deeper stack of whys, so to speak, right? It's like, why are we working on this problem? Well, because of this other problem. Why does that even exist in the first place? Because of these conditions. And why is that important to the business? And so, when you can go all the way back to someone who's external to your company can understand why you're doing something, then you've done something right in terms of being able to kind of explain everything. And I think for me, it kind of comes down to like a particular PM's skill set, which is being able to use or wear someone else's shoes. And, can you sometimes I kind of conceptually wipe my brain of context and build up the case again from that wiped out state, so that I'm not operating on all these assumptions that like are kind of implicitly in my head that some other people might not know about.
Got it. So it's kind of about detaching and kind of recognizing who your audience is, right? Like explaining a way that they can understand.
Exactly. And, I think like there's so many layers to it, right? Like, the company all hands that you do might be different in terms of the level of whys you have to explain from your immediate team who has a lot of shared context, or your customers might need to kind of understand a different level of why. And so I think you're absolutely right. Like knowing your audience is, a story is written for someone who's listening to the story. So the first thing you need to do is put yourself in the shoes of someone who's going to hear your story, right?
And just to kind of close on this, like, do you, like when you give a big speech at Config or something, do you like talk it out to yourself to practice, or how do you get ready for explaining the why? Yeah.
I mean, I spend a lot of time actually on the kind of the storyboard or the outline. and basically saying, okay, how does everything flow together? And also, it's not just the words, it's the visuals that you're using, right? Sometimes there's a very succinct way to show something, and your visuals can also create a kind of cadence and rhythm. And so, I actually spend more time in my head planning out like how the story is laid out, refactoring the story. And I spend a much less time actually practicing it. I mean, I should probably practice it more, but like, like it's the weight is more on like the planning and the architecting rather than just like the delivery. But, that's just me stylistically. And certainly, there are people who are much better at delivery than me who probably are, have a different balance. But it kind of speaks to the importance of like the storyboard and feeling like those frames are right.
Got it. Interesting. It's making a user journey when you're building a product to a certain extent. Right?
Yeah.
It's the same concept.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So let's talk about this big AI release that you're doing for Figjam. And maybe we can start with how Figjam like briefly evolved from Figma in the first place.
You may remember it's the height of the pandemic. We had quarantine, and there are a lot of people using Figma in Figma design, as we call it, in really interesting ways. People were having happy hours there, and just hanging out and playing games. They were running retros and meetings and stand-ups. And, it was kind of this interesting way to have this third space, if you will, where, it was an immersive enough environment, but it wasn't overbearing, but you could get everyone engaged because you could see people's cursors, you could react, you could kind of respond in real time to things. So we just found that a lot of our customers and people in our community were using Figma in this really interesting way. And that gave us the inspiration to think, well, these use cases are actually useful for a lot of different people, not just designers. And the reality is like actually 2/3 of our weekly actives are non-designers anyway, right? So what could it mean to build a tool that's more tailored for them? And so we started pushing on that idea, and that was the emergence of Figjam, which we brought into beta the next year in 2021. And since then, it's been really cool to see people take it in very different directions, whether it's some of the things that you might expect, like, creating brainstorms and user flows and, diagrams and things like that, all the way to running all sorts of meetings that maybe have nothing to do with product design or product development, but it's just more engaging because people can have lightweight ways to interact or engage, give a thumbs up, emote fire, whatever that might look like. So that's been, the evolution of Figma to Figjam.
I will say that of the meetings that I've had with Figjam has been the best meetings because like the product itself is just so fun to use. I don't know if you guys have fun as a core principle early on, or it's just, you let the designer just make it fun.
Yeah. Well, it was really interesting because it actually was, I distinctly remember this. This was 2 months before we were launching like Figjam to beta, where we had a board meeting where the board was asking us, what is the differentiator for Figjam? Because there are a lot of other whiteboard tools out there. And Dylan said, well, it's the fact that it's fun, and then, we actually were like, wait, it's not fun enough. We need to really lean into that. So, Emily and Jenny, who are the product and design leaders on Figjam, actually ran a sprint. They called it Figjam Fun Jam. And they came up with all the features like, cursor chat and emoting and all these things that didn't actually exist in February of 2021, two months before we launched. So you're absolutely right. Fun was the principle, with the hypothesis that, actually a lot of workplace tools are a little bit boring. You kind of get confined in your box. Maybe like, you have to really feel like you put a lot of effort in to express yourself. And we're kind of saying, hey, here's an infinite canvas. They're really lightweight ways to express yourself or, react to things. And you can get as creative as you want and have all the space to do it. So I think it's worked out in terms of like the hypothesis around bringing fun to the workplace actually really helps, engagement, which is a really important part of, getting things done.
Yeah, I love it. And I'm sure it must have been fun to build too. So let's talk about the AI features. Maybe you can briefly explain what they are and maybe like how this project even got started in the first place.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you how it started. We had this big AI hackathon earlier this year, and, somebody built this amazing, we had a lot of actually cool ideas, but a particular one that we all really loved was this called Jambot. And Jambot is this visual way in which you can take a sticky, for example, plug it into Jambot, and Jambot can do different things. It can rewrite that sticky. It can turn that sticky into an entire story or a haiku, and then you can keep iterating on it and say, hey, actually make this more fun or change the tone or things like that. And it was this really interesting way to visually explore your creativity, right? And, whereas before, like in something like ChatGPT, you're going back and forth and, and via text, and that's super fun too. But there's something visual that was interesting, or creating forks in the road of like, oh, what if I go this direction or that direction? What could it look like? And tracing back all your steps in this kind of like immersive way. That was really fun. So that was kind of what started, and, we got a lot of usage out of it, and people were really intrigued, and, obviously motivated us to think about, okay, how do we bring these features even more natively? And then the other kind of like motivation was just like, one of the thought experiments that I always had was, Figjam can be intimidating in a weird way, because you can arrive at this infinite canvas and like, how do I actually get started? Like, it sounds cool to run a meeting in Figjam, but like, I don't know how to do that. And one concept we kind of pitched internally was, there's some people in our company who are really great at making great Figjam boards, and that are like, make the meetings really fun and efficient. There's Emily and Jenny on my team. They're the PM, like product lead and design lead for Figjam. And, like, we were always like, it would be so great if we could just deploy Emily and Jenny to every single team out there, like, and it's like, send them in a box and send them to every customer. And so Emily and Jenny in a box kind of became a meme. And we're like, wait, AI actually can help do this. Like, we know some of the best practices. We know what, great meetings look like. What if it could be easy to be like, here's what the kind of meeting I'm trying to run, and like, like what could that template look like? Or, how could I get a file to that state so I can go from there? So that was kind of the first thing of like, there was a distinct, user need of like, feeling like it's a lot of work to facilitate a meeting. How do we make that faster? And then there are these other obvious workflow things that, people were really always like asking us for, which is, you run this really big brainstorm and it's great, it's generative, but as you know, brainstorms can be really messy. It's like, where do you go from there once you've gotten your entire team to give you 100 different ideas, right? And usually like what you do is you want to kind of vote on the best ideas, but even, figuring out, well, what are we even voting on is actually like a manual process of like, okay, these ideas seem very like similar, and depending on how you cluster them, it can actually affect the vote. Or, and that's what kind of forces you to think about, okay, what could it mean for AI to help sort, ideas and stickies into key themes? And then, summarization is another thing, which is, it's really great to have this amazing brainstorm or session in a Figjam file, but it's always, every great meeting ends with, well, what are next steps? And so, like, being able to summarize what happened in a pretty objective manner, like, which gives you a really great starting point for identifying, okay, like, here are the things that need to happen, or here is what happened, and be able to even like do something like copy paste that into Slack really easily. Those are some of key user problems we saw in Figjam, independent of AI. And AI just so happened to like be a really effective and efficient way to solve that.
Got it. So, building an AI product is a pretty winding path, as you know, right? Like, so maybe you can share a moment during the process where it was like particularly challenging, or like it was really tough in building this product.
Totally. Yeah. And I mean, there are many moments like where we looked at some of the summaries that were being generated and we're like, wait a minute, like there are 10 stickies and the summary has 10 bullets. Like that's not really helpful. Or, when we created these templates look really primitive, like, like it's not that much better than people randomly putting some stuff down. And so I think one of the things that we really had to learn was, how do you actually, and this is actually especially true for PMs, like how do you actually really get involved in terms of owning quality, right? Because I think sometimes it's easy to look at AI and think of it as a black box, right? And you say, okay, well, either it figures it out or it doesn't, and I don't have too much control over it because like, you just don't exactly understand how it works. It's not deterministic. And, I found that, and even myself, like having been new to building these kinds of features, it's really easy to kind of feel intimidated or feel like it's not really my job to debug what's happening in the box. Right. But actually, like, if you can take a much more proactive role in owning quality and saying, hey, this is not good enough, or actually, this is the kind of output that we want, it becomes an exercise even with your engineers around like, well, what are the prompts that could be like designed to like better produce that? Right. And just really understanding what are we feeding and what's coming back and what would we prefer to come back? how can we exercise more creativity around like what we're feeding in the first place? So I think there's just kind of this journey of realizing how to get involved in a way that I think a lot of our PMs went through as part of this process, including myself.
Yeah, I think, I'm not sure about your experience, but like it kind of requires like a lot of manual work, right? Just like improving the prompt and seeing the output and doing it again. I don't know if the team had to,
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of like a debugging mindset in a way. But, once you kind of realize that is actually the core part of the product job, like sometimes you're like, you think your only job is to define the user experience and like the golden, the happy path. But actually your core job in these cases is actually like, like that trial and error.
Yeah. And did you get the users involved too, to look for edge cases or try to have it go off the rails?
For sure. Yeah. I mean, like, we have a big culture of, dog fooding internally. And, so that was kind of the first step, of course. But we released, this to a small group of alpha users too, and I know you got access and thank you for, trying it out. But like, those are the ways in which we start to understand what works, what doesn't, or, even like what's good enough or, whether people are actually encountering like real aha moments. But yeah.
Okay. And how do you decide when this product was good enough to ship? I think you bundled a bunch of features together for this, right? So like, how do you, just a general sense?
Yeah. I mean, I think that like the biggest thing is like, there's a portfolio of things, right? Like there's some things that, for example, in the cases around generating a template, it's great from going from 0 to 1. But at the same time, maybe some people don't need that. But what people really need is something that's like more deeply integrated to their today's workflows, like, running a brainstorm and summarizing that. So I think there's kind of this portfolio approach of, okay, like what kinds of users can we hit? And like, can we have a package that kind of like can feel useful to anyone, regardless of how they use it? So I think there's a little bit of like bundling we wanted to do to have a bit of a moment versus just, ship a bunch of, things in succession. But that was really kind of more of a, like bundling strategy, I guess. But when it comes to feeling good about, its readiness, like there's just a lot of like, it was based on what our customers are telling us. And even 2 weeks before, there's a lot of, feedback around quality that we were unsure of. And so, yeah, it was a little bit of a roller coaster ride. And we also acknowledge that it's, it's actually just a work in progress, right? Like we're going to learn a lot. And people are going to tell us at scale, like when it breaks down for them, or we're going to be able to tell what kind of queries that people are trying. And as a result of that, hopefully we get better too. And so that's the hope with a feature like this.
So like, what would you say is like success from the launch? Is it just seeing people come back to use it again, or just like see all the new use cases people might have?
Yeah. I mean, I think a few things, right? One is, more than just people continue to use it again. I mean, that's like a secondary metric that like, show like feature retention is a good proxy. Like, but at the end of the day, it's like, are they getting their job done? Right. And there are people who were never able to facilitate a meeting that maybe, this lowered the activation energy for doing so. And that's really kind of wonderful from we activated a user, helped them understand what Figjam was about, or, like, maybe that meeting where it was, unclear what next steps were, or, like the likelihood that people run another brainstorm again because they found it an effective place. Like those are the ultimate use cases we care about versus just like using AI. Like I really think that AI helps with product understanding and help people get things done effectively or more efficiently. But like, those are the things that I look for as the first category of like what we want to do. But the second category is also learning, which is that, we have our community has a really wild imagination, right? Like they come up with all sorts of cool stuff. And so when we start looking at, what are people trying to do at Figjam? That's really interesting for us too, to see, okay, what are they trying to generate? Maybe we don't do a good enough job on some of those use cases. Like, does that inspire us to think a little bit differently about like the use cases we want to enable? And, Figjam at the end of the day is like, is an infinite canvas that people can do anything on in a sense. And so I think having more visibility into what people are trying is going to give us a lot of good inspiration for directions.
Awesome. Yeah. I'll tell you my personal experience. So, at my current company, usually the designers use Figjam to run like a brainstorming section. And yeah, usually people will love it, but then people like me get intimidated. Like, wow, this designer came up with such a good template. It's like, I'll never be able to use Figjam the same way. Yeah. So I think there's a lot of upside here. This feature.
That's absolutely our hope. Yeah.
Awesome. So something else I would chat about is I think Figma's mission is to make design accessible to everyone, right? So how do you cater to Figma's power users, but keep the product simple enough for people like me who don't really know what they're doing? How do you balance these two? Yeah.
I mean, it's definitely a theme that we've been grappling with a lot. And in fact, we have some initiatives going on that are addressing this right now. But, I think that like a couple things, right? Like you want to make sure that you balance streamlining but also not make it feel like it's dumbed down. Like that's kind of the trade-off I think that you're alluding to, right? And, there are a lot of like industry ways to solve this, right? Like, is it progressive disclosure? Like, are there things like shortcuts? Are there other ways in which you can kind of like expose the right functionality at the right time? And I think all of those are viable solutions and all of those are things we think about. At least on Figma, there's a particular dimension that we look at, which is, one of the ways in which we add a lot of power today is via design systems. We add a lot of like powerful design systems features like we did in Config, our user conference earlier this year, like variables, right? And, they make design systems more powerful because it gives design systems managers way more control, but also, it kind of gives people these components that they're much easier to use. And our hope is as we add more power, we differentiate between the people creating these design systems and people consuming these design systems. Because, hopefully in a world where in the future, someone, whether a designer or non-designer, can arrive at their team's, workspace and open up a Figma file, and it just feels like you're just dragging in a bunch of Lego blocks to assemble a screen and get you really quickly started. It should feel as simple as that. But on the other hand, like really underneath the hood, in order to make those simple feeling Lego blocks, a lot of, things needed to happen. A lot of power needed to be created. So we expose a lot of functionality and power to design systems creators. So kind of in our heads, we always say, hey, with design systems creation, like maybe it's okay to add a little bit of complexity because they really want that control. But for consumption, it absolutely should feel like really simple. I'm not saying we're fully there yet, but like that's kind of spiritually how we think about it for Figma design. And then for Figjam, we feel like it should always feel simple. And that's why, like, there are a lot of product decisions that we've made that intentionally are different from Figma design in terms of like, okay, like, well, maybe instead of giving infinite choice, like we make more sensible defaults or, things of this nature. Or like maybe we make this controls feel less like there's some powerful stuff on the properties panel on the right and rather something inline that feels like right there and contextual and within reach or, feels like you're directly manipulating something. So those are some things that are really important for Figjam as well.
What do you think is like the kind of like the magic moment for like a non-designer using Figma? Is it making something they're proud of themselves or? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think, oftentimes a non-designer is actually, being brought into a file with a designer, right? Or opening up a file that a designer made. Like that's, what our data shows, right? And, they're able to poke around. And I mean, certainly the magic moment is being able to just see things being updated in real time, right? But there is also ways in which, for example, like you open up a prototype or you open up a design file and your designer is showing you around and you want to observe them, right? You want to follow them. And then you kind of like, they take over your screen and like they walk you through the file. I think that's a pretty magical moment because it kind of really feels collaborative. Like it really feels like you're looking over the shoulder and or maybe they're walking you through the hallway to show you some stuff. Like, so those are pretty magical ways. I think like another one that I really love is, oftentimes as a collaborator, maybe your first view is something like a prototype, right? Maybe it's a deck, maybe it's a prototype, and you're able to add some comments to it. And the designer's able to see it in their view as an editor, right? And so they're just in the designs and they can respond to it immediately, even though they're not necessarily in the prototype with you. And so those are some potential magic moments as well. But, our hope is like, as you said, like there's nothing more like fun than creating and making. And I think like our aspirations to make it so that, anyone feels comfortable doing that. And there's a lot of work that still needs to be done to make it feel that way. But, that's definitely kind of like when you think of our mission, what we're excited about.
My designer jokes that I'm like, I see 0.1 designer or something, learning from her. But like, yeah, like, as someone who cares a lot about craft, I wish I had better design skills. So like for people like me who want to learn, like what's the best way to learn this stuff or start learning this stuff?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I feel like a couple of things. One is just like, I find it I'm the kind of, there are a lot of people who are really good at learning and like can go watch a YouTube video, can go read up on things and become better. I'm unfortunately not one of those people. Like I need a project and I need to have someone to emulate or copy, you know? And I think like those are things I always look for. So for example, it sounds like you have a wonderful designer who like, you're learning from. And like one of the things I used to always do is just like alt drag, which is like, duplicating like something that they've already made and playing around with something and seeing if like, I always have ideas for like different things to try out. It's always intimidating maybe to start from scratch, but like if it's just like a tiny fork off of something that exists, that's like the beginnings of something, right? And then you start wrestling with it. And you're like, oh, okay, this is how you do it. Or like, wait, I don't understand how to change this. Then it forces you to learn about like, oh, this is how a component works. Or, oh, this is auto layout. And that's why things flow this way. And so you throw yourself into something that already works and then you break it a little bit. And then, okay, Command Z. Okay, that was messed up. Like, but okay, what was that? And so I think those are ways that like I find the best way to learn in a sense. Right. And then the great thing about Figma is like there is someone who can be in the file with you. And if you have a patient enough friend or coworker, they can show you a few things. So that's the way that I learn the most, just by just like diving in and trying. And there are a lot of resources, for example, in the community where you can do that. And I think that's why we think like there are two things about Figma that I think is like really been helpful for helping people learn faster. And like the first thing is just the fact that it's kind of like open source. Like, there's a Figma file that someone was worked on. You can just, we have a community of Figma files. Yeah. And dive into it and just like inspect how it was done, right? Like there's nothing more powerful than like starting with something rather than something from scratch. And then the other thing is like it's in the browser, right? Like you don't have to go at it alone and someone else can be in there helping you out. So hopefully those two things make it a little bit easier, but it's also our jobs to help you like kind of ramp up as well.
Yeah. I think getting my hands dirty and breaking things is the best way I learn too. Yeah. So let's close with two questions. First, I'd love to hear about how you're using AI in your everyday life. I guess both at work and also just like at home.
I mean, it's really awesome to have Figjam have AI right now because every single meeting I'm basically in Figjam in some way, right? And sometimes there's this discussion happening or brainstorm happening. I go often to the side and like, I just want to quickly summarize like what's happening. Or like we run these meetings sometimes with the PM team where we give a lot of asynchronous, or it's kind of like a multi-threaded meeting, right? Where people give a lot of updates and on like wins that they've had or, shout outs that they want to give or stuff like that. And we spent 10 minutes of heads down time just silently putting stuff and reacting to each other. And as N has gotten bigger in our team, like, with like 30, 40 PMs, it's like, I just kind of want to like take that and instead of like trying to read everything, like just extract out key themes really quickly. And so like those are some ways in which, I've started to use AI even in meetings, right? Which is really cool. So that's kind of like the first one. AI in my, personal life, I think like one of the things that I find in at least the creative process is I think just the nature of the way I build things. Like I'm actually not like really, I'm not good at drawing, I'm not good at starting from scratch, but I'm very good at like when there's some idea, I can like refine from there. And so I actually use, as the first draft, for example, like, I design like logos for my softball team and the jerseys on it. And it's like, okay, there's some concept like, what if there is this object placed with this object? Well, AI can generate that. And then like I can refine from there and turn it into a vector or whatever. And so that's kind of like a workflow I've started using. Whereas before, maybe it was just like you search around Google Images and hope that a search term like kind of gets you some things that you need and you cobble it together.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
It's really cool that you're still spending time on your craft. It sounds like, or at least using AI on your craft, even though you're leading teams and like doing all this other stuff at work. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think like one of the first questions we ask every Figmate, people at Figma is like, how are you a maker? And I think we all have that itch to like create things and, we find side projects. So in my case, sometimes it's just making decks, where you kind of like release that kind of desire or energy.
Yeah. I've been interviewing a bunch of folks. I also talked to Scott and I would love to just shift this PM culture back to making as opposed to just like all the internal stuff and like, like alignment and stuff like that, Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. I guess just to wrap up, like when Figma's growing, you've been there for 4 years. How do you keep this maker culture alive, in the company, man? Like instead of just a bunch of people in meetings that align with each other.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think a few things. Like one is, we do try to hire people who love making inherently, right? And so it's definitely true that as you get bigger, there's a lot of other things that you have to do, but like people are here because they love to make and get their hands dirty in a sense. And like I'm that way, Dylan's that way. And so, it's definitely a bias that we have in our culture. I think there are some ways in which you have to create that like programmatically. So for example, at Figma, we have Maker Week. And we say, hey, like the only requirement is like you make something. And so sometimes that means people make, like product ideas or, but then other times people are making, their craft projects together or, they're doing murals in the office together or things like that. And I think those kinds of moments to pull out and be like super creative actually like get the juices flowing and a lot of ideas have emerged from that or a lot of creativity comes out of that. So those are some things that I think are really important to give space for because it's so easy to just be like overwhelmed by everything in front of you or the problem that you're solving and forget to take that kind of like, exercise that part of your brain.
Awesome.